First of all, I want to be clear about what this episode is not. It's not a moral argument about social media. It's not a suggestion that platforms are malicious or that people who use them are making a mistake. What it is a look at what the neuroscience tells us what's actually happening in the brain during social media use and in the period afterwards, and what a 2026 study found when they measured what changes when people significantly reduce that use. The short version is what the EEG research shows is this. Social media engagement suppresses alpha waves, which are the brain's signature of relaxed, unfocused alertness. And it prolongs beta and gamma activity, which are associated with focused cognitive effort and arousal. The notable part here is not that these things happen during engagement. That's important. But it's that they continue for a significant period after the person has stopped scrolling. The brain doesn't come down quickly from social media engagement. It remains in an elevated cognitive excitation state. And that matters for what happens next, whether it be emotional regulation, sustained attention, sleep onset, decision quality. All of those functions are impaired by the excitation state that social media engagement leaves the brain in. And the new research tells us something specific about which psychological mechanisms are driving the mental health effects. It's not primarily about time spent. It's about comparison load and what the brain does with unfavorable comparisons. So today, Cole and I are going to look at the mechanism, the research findings, and what evidence-based use actually looks like for people who are trying to protect their cognitive and emotional performance.
Welcome to Neuroscience Digest, powered by my BrainWise coach. I am Cole Bastian.
And I'm Phil Dixon.
And in this digest, we're looking at a 2026 study in scientific reports from Nature that identified the specific psychological mechanisms driving the mental health effects of social media use and what changes when that use is significantly reduced. Phil will take the neuroscience of what the brain is doing during and after engagement, and I'll bring in the practical and professional implications of this. And of course, a little plug for us. If this show is helping you think differently about how your brain works, please leave us a 5-star rating and review wherever it is you get your podcasts. And also like, comment, share, and subscribe on all of our social platforms. You can find us everywhere at My BrainWise Coach. So Phil, let me set up the study, and then I want you to take the neural mechanism. Castillo, Gualda, Rothji, and Ramos published in Nature's Scientific Reports in 2026, looking at the psychological pathways connecting social media use to mental health outcomes. The key finding from their mediation analysis was that blocking connectivity to social media produced measurable improvements in anxiety and depressive symptoms, subjective well-being, sustained attention, and sleep duration. But the more interesting finding was which variables mediated those improvements. The benefits came through 5 pathways: less time online, more offline socializing, stronger felt social connectedness, better self-control, and longer sleep. The primary psychological mechanisms linking heavy use to poorer mental health were social comparison and maladaptive emotion regulation, specifically suppression and rumination. It is not primarily about screen time. It is, however, about what the brain is doing with the content while it is there.
The EEG research gives us the neural substrate for that. Social media engagement suppresses alpha wave activity. Alpha waves are associated with a state of relaxed, unfocused, but alert, the mental equivalent of idle processing, if you like. They're also associated with emotional regulation capacity and the brain's ability to let go of irrelevant stimuli. When alpha is suppressed, the brain is in a more reactive, more aroused state. What the EEG studies show is that suppression continues even after this person stops engaging. The elevated beta and gamma activity persists. The brain stays primed.
And a primed, aroused brain is not one that is well positioned for the kind of regulation that social media comparison requires.
Yeah, social comparison is inherently a self-referential process. We do it all the time. Festinger's foundational work established that we evaluate our own standing by comparing ourselves to others. And when comparisons are unfavorable, the self-referential processing networks, the medial part of the PFC, and another part of the brain that we're not going to go into a lot of detail about, activate in a way that is functionally overlapping with threat processing. Unfavorable upward social comparison, looking at someone who is more, appears to be doing better, has a better house, better car, seems to be more successful, does not activate curiosity or aspiration as a primary neural response. It activates the threat detection system. And a brain that is already in an elevated excitation state from the engagement in social media itself is more vulnerable to the activation, not less.
Which gives the maladaptive emotion regulation finding a clearer mechanism. If the threat response fires from unfavorable comparison, and the brain is already aroused, suppression and rumination are the responses that require the least metabolic shift from the current state. They are essentially the path of least resistance, not because they are helpful, but because the neural cost of alternative regulation strategies is higher when the excitation baseline is elevated.
Brady and colleagues showed that moral and emotional language spreads significantly faster on social platforms than neutral content. Each moral, emotional word in a message increases the likelihood of sharing. The algorithmic environment is not neutral. We all know that. It is systemically selecting for the content most likely to trigger arousal and outrage. A person scrolling through that feed is not navigating a random sample of human expression. They're navigating a curated sequence of high arousal content that's specifically optimized to extend their engagement, which means to extend the excitation state, which means it's harder for regulation to occur.
I want to make a distinction that the research supports and that is practically useful. The mental health effects are not uniform across types of use. Posting, interacting, responding has a different psychological profile than just passive use. Scrolling and consuming without interaction, if you say. Passive consumption is the mode most strongly associated with social comparison. You are observing other people's curated presentation of their lives without the reciprocal dynamic of interaction. And the comparison load is high, but the connection benefit is low.
And emotional contagion susceptibility varies by individual in ways that are very relevant here. Some people are more susceptible to the emotional states broadcasting content than others, which is a real neurobiological variable, not just a personality preference. A person with high emotional contagion susceptibility who scrolls through a high arousal, moral emotional feed is exposed to a much higher effective dose of negative emotional activation than someone lower on that trait consuming the same content.
Which means the same feed has a different psychological impact on different people. And the platforms have no interest in accounting for that. The optimization is for aggregate engagement, not for individual well-being. The study's self-control finding is one I want to dwell on for a moment because it reframes the abstinence versus willpower conversation that comes up every time social media and mental health are discussed. One of the pathways through which reduced social media use improved outcomes was improved self-control. This is not a moral finding about discipline. It is a cognitive resource finding. The prefrontal cortex systems that support self-regulation are the same systems that are taxed by sustained arousal and comparison processing. When that load is reduced, the resource becomes more available for everything else.
Yeah, and you've heard us talk about dopamine before, and those mechanisms matter here as well. Variable reward schedules, the unpredictability of whether a post gets engagement, whether someone likes something, whether there's something new in the feed, they all activate the nucleus accumbens in a way that is structurally identical to the mechanism underlying, guess what, gambling behavior. The reward is in the anticipation of the uncertain outcome, not in the outcome itself. This is why infinite scroll is extraordinarily effective at sustaining engagement. The next scroll might contain something rewarding. The uncertainty itself is the hook. And that mechanism is independent of whether the content is pleasant, interesting, or true.
What the research supports is intentional use design rather than willpower-based abstinence. The study found that self-control improved as a consequence of reduced use, not just as a prerequisite for it, which suggests that the strategy is to restructure the conditions of use rather than to rely on a finite cognitive resource to maintain limits on an environment specifically designed to override limits. Designated context and times for social media engagement rather than ambient availability. Distinguishing between the platforms and use patterns that produce connection and those that primarily produce comparison. And for leaders specifically, clarity about what your organization's implicit expectations around professional social media presence are, costing the people who have to maintain them. So, Phil, what are you carrying forward from today's conversation?
I think we've discovered two things. First, the excitation state that social media engagement produces doesn't end when you stop scrolling. And the functions that suffer in that elevated state, like emotional regulation, sustained attention, sleep onset, are exactly the functions that social comparison and maladaptive regulation have already been taxing. The costs compound, they're not just parallel. Second thing, the variable reward schedule mechanism is operating independent of your intentions. You can use social media for entirely legitimate purposes, professional connection, information, genuine community. And the impact of dopamine on that pull of uncertain reward is still running under that use. Awareness of the mechanism is not the same as immunity to it. Structural redesign of the conditions of use is more reliable than an attempted sustained willpower.
For me, it's the comparison function and who it is actually serving. Emotional posts find your tribe, but do not expand it. Passive consumption of others' curated lives produces comparison load without connection benefit. The platforms are optimized to maximize the time you spend doing the things that are least likely to serve your well-being and most likely to serve their engagement metrics. That is not a conspiracy. It is an optimization function. Knowing what it is optimizing for is the beginning of using the tool on your terms rather than its terms. So thank you for spending some time with us today, our BrainWise friends. We hope you got some value out of this conversation. And until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and always stay BrainWise.